Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Centre for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI, as we say. My name's Fred Kuntz. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CIGI. I'd like to thank our public event sponsor, Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support of the CIGI Signature Lecture Series. Thanks also to you for joining us at this event, whether you're here as part of the live audience or joining us through our webcast. Following this evening's address, we welcome questions from both audiences here at the CIGI Auditorium with the microphones at the bottom of the stairs, or through the live chat function on your screen if you're watching from home. Please remember to state your name and to keep the questions brief. Many Canadians agree we need to take action on climate change, but some also worry about the effect on the economy. This false dichotomy, which pits environmental headway against economic well-being, has unfortunately polarized the climate discussion in Canada and made progress difficult. So instead, here to propose what he calls a radically practical approach to advancing the climate policy debate is Christopher Ragan. Chris has been a professor of economics at McGill University since 1989. He's a research fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute, where from 2010 through 2013, he held the Institute's David Dodge Chair in Monetary Policy, and for many years was a member of the Institute's Monetary Policy Council. He's also the author of Economics, the most widely used introductory economics textbook in Canada, and he has a regular column in the Globe and Mail. He's been a special advisor in the Federal Department of Finance and the Bank of Canada. And since November 2014, Chris has also been chair of Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission. The commission was formed by a group of experienced policy-minded economists from across the country, as you saw in the video, seeking to broaden the discussion of eco-fiscal policy reform beyond the academic sphere and into the realm of practical policy application. The Eco-Fiscal Commission and its commissioners are fully independent, and they aim to serve policymakers across the political spectrum at all levels of government, issuing publications and research over the next few years to promote a more informed discussion of one of the most serious and urgent challenges facing humanity today. So please join me in welcoming tonight's special guest, Professor Chris Ragan.
Thank you very much, Fred. Thank you all, and thank you to CIGI for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here. I've been in this room speaking once before, and every time I come into this room, or at least both times so far, I just think that McGill desperately needs a room like this. I like giving lectures or talks, but I really like giving them in nice spaces. So Fred and I were just talking on the way over from the restaurant that how nice it would be to give a talk like this in a Roman Colosseum kind of thing. So if you ever build one of those, please let me know. So what I would like to talk about is a little bit about the commission itself, and mostly about the report that we released a few weeks ago. And if the radically practical approach to climate policy piques your interest, that's a good thing. I won't tell you yet why it is radically practical, but I'll get there. So, and I hope you'll excuse me if I wander a little bit away from the podium, because I have a Madonna-style microphone, so I'm allowed to do that. So what brings the commission together? So these 12 economists backed up by this advisory board of really exceptional Canadians, and I'll get to them later. But what brings us together is the shared conviction that we can do better as an economy and as a country in terms of economic performance and in terms of environmental performance, and that those two things really go together. There's an obstacle in this. The obstacle is the belief that those things don't go together. The obstacle is the belief that you can't have more of one without less of the other. But we actually think that if you look at some of our policies in place today, and I'll get in more detail, that we can actually have our cake and eat it too. That we can actually rejig some of our policies in ways that will improve the environment and improve the economy at the same time. So here is just a little bit of data to suggest that we can do better in terms of environmental performance. So here's what is going to be on the right-hand side of that diagram when it comes up. There's going to be 3 different measures of our nation's output per unit of some sort of resource used, okay? The amount of output or income we generate relative to the amount of resources that we use to generate that income, or water we use to generate that income, or greenhouse gas emissions that we emit in the process of generating that income. So a low measure is a bad thing. A low measure says we don't get much output out of a lot of resource input or a lot of water input or a lot of CO2 emissions. A high measure would be a good thing. And what you'll see eventually will be, you'll see 3 sets of bar charts. And the red one is Canada, of course. And there's 6 other countries, and they are different colors. And the other countries are chosen to be in 2 groups. The other countries are some of the kind of usual comparator countries, rich G7 type countries, the UK, United States, Germany, etc. But there's also a couple of countries that are chosen because they're small and they're resource intensive, Norway and Australia. And when that chart goes up, what you'll see, interesting, I mean, I think this is a test. I think this is a test. What you'll see is that Canada actually is lower than the other 3. Look at that. 3 right-hand side sets of bar charts. You'll see that Canada is lower than most of the other countries, which means we are inefficient in terms of our use of resources, not our production of resources, our use of resources when we produce output, and our use of water when we produce output, and our emission of CO2. We just do a lot of that resource use in terms of our producing. So we could be better in terms of our environmental and our resource performance. And so the screen you see here is 3 sets of bar charts. This is about our performance in economic terms. So what you'll see is 2 things that I'm going to draw your attention to. One is our GDP per capita. That's a measure, that's the broadest measure of average per person income. GDP being gross domestic product. And Canada does very well. Canada's not the highest in this group of countries, but we're pretty high. But you all know that. You know that we are a rich country, and we are lucky to be in a rich country. But the problem, when you see this graph, is going to be in the middle set of figures, because the middle set of figures is going to show how Canada performs in terms of innovation relative to the other countries. That middle set shows that Canada doesn't do too well in terms of our innovation performance relative to these other countries. So here's the connection between the second set of figures and the third, the ones on the right, is that what drives GDP per capita over the long haul, and I don't mean over 1 year to the next, but over 5 years and 10 years and 30 years, what drives per capita income is productivity growth. And what drives productivity growth is innovation. So even though we're doing quite well on the right-hand side of this figure, if we don't pick up our game in the middle part of this figure, we're not going to be able to continue doing well on the right-hand side. Poor performance in innovation will threaten our current high living standards. So we've got to get more innovative if we want to sustain our richness. So we can do better in terms of the environment, and we can do better in terms of the economy. So what's our solution? Just take a moment to read this cartoon. If some of you have bad eyes, I will read it for you, because I couldn't read it from back there. Our goal is to write bug-free software. I'll pay a $10 bonus for every bug you find and fix. Yahoo, we're rich, yes, yes, yes. And then the manager says, well, I hope this drives the right behavior. Well, I'm going to write me a new minivan this afternoon. So, 2 messages here. Incentives matter. And you got to get the incentives right. So what are the incentives that I'm talking about? Well, we have a fiscal structure in this country, or plural, fiscal structures. The way that our governments, whether they are municipal governments or provincial governments or federal governments. We have governments that collect revenue in a variety of ways, and then they spend revenues in a variety of ways. And those tax systems, the systems that are designed to collect revenue, aren't just about collecting revenue, though that's an important function that they serve. They're also about collecting revenue in a particular way, and this is where incentives matter. Our tax systems, plural, currently, are replete with features that influence behavior, and they're designed to influence behavior. How many people in the room have an RRSP? RRSPs are tax designed, incentives designed to provide you with a financial incentive to save more. And they are actually pretty effective at doing so. TFSAs, different structure, same basic goal, designed to change incentives in such a way that you save more. Investment tax credits are things built into the tax system designed to change firms' behavior, designed to provide incentives for them to do more investment. Accelerated depreciation allowances are designed to increase investment. They allow firms to write off the cost of investment sooner and therefore provide an incentive to actually increase investment. Tuition fee tax credits are designed partly to actually provide incentives to go to school more, or to have more people going to school. So the tax systems are in this country, and in most countries, are replete with features designed to change incentives. Some of them have been designed with crass political objectives in mind. Some of them have been instituted and then taken out. Some of them have been instituted and then stayed. But many of them have been designed very sensibly and have endured over the years because they actually achieve their objectives. RRSPs being a classic example. So what's the problem? The problem is that our tax systems, our fiscal systems, have evolved over the years in kind of an unusual way. They've evolved to the point where most of our revenue, at any level of government, most of our revenues are collected by taxing the things that we all agree we want more of. And what we all agree we want more of, or I think most of us agree that we want more of, is income, profits, employment, and the fruits of our innovation. All of those are good things. I've never met anybody who thinks those are bad things. Yet we tax them. We tax employment with payroll taxes. We tax profits with corporate income taxes. We tax personal income with personal income taxes. We tax the fruits of innovation by taxing profits. And we collect almost none of our revenue by taxing the things that we all agree are bad. I've never met anybody who likes pollution, no matter what you call it. Carbon emissions, dirty water, air pollutants, particulates. I've never met anybody who says those are great things, yet we tax them almost not at all. And by not taxing them, you're effectively encouraging them. So, our policy approach, the Eco-Fiscal Commission's policy approach to rejigging the fiscal structures is to rejig those incentives. Okay, actually collect more revenue by taxing the things that we agree that we dislike, and maybe collect less revenue, or at least less as a share, by taxing things that we can agree that we do like. And there's a fiscal opportunity here. So what does this graph show? This graph shows for our 7 countries the share of GDP, the share of national income that is collected from environmentally related taxes. Gas taxes would be in there, okay? So the numbers are pretty low. The United States is about 0.5% of GDP. Canada is just a little bit over 1. The other countries are a little bit over 2. So you can look at this chart in 2 different ways. You can look at this chart and say, wow, Canada could do better. We could double the amount of revenues that we collect from environmentally related taxes by going from 1% of GDP to 2, and then we'd be kind of like Germany and the UK. Well, that's a fair interpretation. The other interpretation of this figure is much bigger. And you think about how much of GDP, how much of national income is collected in any kind of tax revenue in any of these countries? And the answer is between 35 and 45%. Depending on which country you choose, it's going to be 35 to 45% of GDP that these governments, all governments squished together, national, provincial, municipal, that all governments squished together collect as a share of GDP. 40%. And we're collecting currently 1% from environmentally related taxes. So what's the opportunity? The opportunity for all of these countries is to say, let's massively scale up the share of our revenues that we get from from taxing pollution, and let's scale down the amount of revenues that we get from taxing the things that we like. So just imagine if Canada were to quintuple its 1 percentage point from 1 to 5, and then scale down its income or other taxes by 4 percentage points. You could leave total government revenue and the scale of government unchanged, but you would, by 4 percentage points, you would have shifted the tax system away from taxing things that you like toward taxing things that you dislike. So that's one way to think about this. So, what are the policies that we're going to suggest? Well, eco-fiscal policies have two parts, and very often the public focuses on part one, but doesn't appreciate part two. So what part one is attach a price to pollution. Attach a price to residential garbage by the bag. Attach a price to effluent going into rivers and streams. Attach a price to carbon emissions. And by attaching a price to pollution, you create an immediate economic or financial incentive to reduce pollution, because all of a sudden you have to pay for it. But you also create an incentive for innovation. So there's an environmental benefit, which is, well, when you price pollution, people are going to pollute less. But there's also an incentive for innovation, because now it's profitable to come up with ways to help me avoid this costly pollution. And firms are really good at coming up with ways to cut costs. So once you build pollution into their costs, they, like always, look for ways to cut their costs. So they come up with innovative ways to do it. And that innovation is very often going to be more general than just the pollution. So you're going to get some economic benefits from that. That's part one. Price pollution, reduce the pollution. Some people don't actually believe that human beings respond to price incentives. Now, I teach Economics 101, I teach other levels of economics. Certainly after Economics 101, most economic students believe that people respond to prices. But it's always kind of struck me as weird how hard it is to convince people sometimes that you do respond to prices. So some people just don't think that humans behave this way. So here is one of the charts that has become my favorite. I've got a bit of ADD when it comes to liking charts. So this one, is my favorite for a while, and then the next one will be my favorite for a while. So this one is from our first report, and it's actually produced from the Council of Canadian Academies. And it shows for 12 countries, it shows the price that we pay per unit of water. It's probably a cubic meter or something like that. And then the per capita consumption of water. So the blue bar is the per capita consumption, and the orange bar is the price that we pay. And you will be hard-pressed to find with real-world economic data a better example of a negative correlation in two variables. So look at Germany. They're at the top of the figure. Germany pays a pretty high price for water, and its per capita consumption is not very much. Look at the bottom of the figure, and you'll see Canada. Canada pays the lowest price among those 10 or 12 countries for water, and shockingly, it's the highest per capita user. And there is a pretty good negative correlation there. So you can say, well, at least in this sample of 12 countries, countries with high prices tend to be countries with low or economical usage of water. Now you might say, well, that's not the prices that's actually driving this result. It's culture, right? There are different cultures, and there are different cultures. But I find it hard to believe, thinking about Germans and Canadians, I find it hard to believe that Germans feel fundamentally differently than Canadians do about washing their hair, or their broccoli, or their clothes. I just find that difficult to believe. I'm prepared to be convinced if you give me some evidence, but I just find that difficult to believe. I do believe that Germans probably feel differently about watering their lawn than Canadians do. But I would also argue that's partly because we pay a very low price for our water, and we have nice big lawns, and we have no compunction about watering our lawns. So this is not the statement that prices is the only thing that matters. The Ecofiscal Commission encounters all kinds of critics, and one type of critic is the one that says there's more to the world than prices. And we say, you betcha, there is more to the world than prices. But make no mistake, prices matter. Prices do change behavior. So what's part two of ecofiscal policies? Part two is, well, if you're going to price pollution, so you're going to charge every time somebody emits carbon or puts out a bag of garbage or dumps effluent into the water or into the air. If you're going to charge every time that happens, you're going to collect some revenues, because you're not going to eliminate it to zero. So you're going to collect some revenues. And then the question is, what do you do with the revenues? So this is where we talk about revenue recycling. And this is where the lion's share of the economic benefits come in from the policy. Part one was about creating the incentive to reduce pollution. But now we've now collected some revenue. Part two is, what economic benefits can we drive from recycling these revenues? So how could we use these revenues? Well, maybe we cut taxes. Maybe we cut personal income taxes. Maybe we cut corporate income taxes. Maybe we invest in clean tech, public support of clean tech. Maybe we use it to provide public transit or other elements of critical public infrastructure. Maybe we use it to reduce debt. And there are other options. General support of R&D. Income transfers direct to low-income families. Lots of options for recycling the revenues. And the nature of the benefits that you're going to get from recycling the revenues depend a lot on which one of those you choose, or indeed which combination of those you choose. So that's part two of ecofiscal policies. So what are the Canadian opportunities for doing this? There's lots. So we are actually a very narrowly defined or mandated commission. We are going to look through this lens called the ecofiscal lens. We're going to look for opportunities to price pollution and recycle the revenues. Price pollution, recycle the revenues. Very narrow. But there's a lot of situations where this applies. So you could talk about road congestion pricing. Road congestion pricing is both an environmental issue and an economic issue. Cars sitting in traffic, idling for minutes or possibly hours is clearly an environmental issue. But also the amount of time that we spend wasted, for the most part, in traffic is a huge economic cost. So road congestion pricing is an example of something that we will write a report on. Water use through metering and charging, but also water pollution. Landfill or I've talked about residential garbage by the bag, but you could talk about commercial garbage and construction garbage, because all of it's going to the same place, which is the landfill, and the landfill is the scarce resource that currently isn't priced much. I don't want to say it's unpriced, it's just priced at a very low rate. So if it becomes scarce, or more scarce over time, you want to think about how to reduce that garbage use, or landfill space use, through pricing. And carbon emissions is a big example, and there are other examples. If you want more examples, you can go to our first report and you can see a bunch of examples. But we will be doing reports on all of these issues. So what are we as a commission? Well, we are 12 policy-experienced economists from across the country. So that's the commission itself. And those commissioners are going to write and author a bunch of reports. Over the next 5 to 6 years, we're only 6 months into this, over the next 5 or 6 years, we will issue 2 major reports a year and probably some little short, snappy reports too. We've got 17 advisors currently, and that advisory board is that group of exceptional Canadians that I referred to earlier. really exceptional Canadians. We call this a transpartisan advisory board. We've got people like Paul Martin and Bob Rae and Mike Harcourt and Preston Manning and Jean Charest. Getting Preston Manning and Jean Charest in the same hemisphere is interesting, okay? Getting Preston Manning and Paul Martin to agree on something is kind of interesting. We have Steve Williams, who's the CEO of Suncor, and Peter Robinson, who's the CEO of the Suzuki Foundation. And they're in the same room and on the same project. We've got Sheila Watt-Cloutier. We've got Janice McKinnon, a former treasurer from Saskatchewan. Jim Dinning, former treasurer from Alberta. Jack Mintz, Canada's #1 tax guru. So we've got this group of pretty exceptional Canadians as advisors, and we get advice from them, and we get direction from them, but they also help us convey the message to Canadians that this is something that all Canadians can get behind. This isn't conservative or liberal or NDP. It's not east or west. It's not left versus right or business versus labor or young versus old. This is just good, down the middle of the road, sensible, practical Canadian policy. And we are independent. And I want to just emphasize the independence for a bit. We are not connected to any government. We are not connected to any political party, any political platform. I can assure you that my job as chair is to make sure that those 11 commissioners, I'm the 12th commissioner, that those 11 commissioners can reach an agreement on the reports that we're writing. And these are, these are type A personality people. And so making sure that I promise you they're independent, okay? I've sensed, I've felt tangibly their independence. And that independence is a crucial part of who we are and what we're saying. We feel that our message about using eco-fiscal policies is buttressed by the messengers. That 12 independent policy experienced economists who are beholden to nobody ought to be listened to more than would otherwise be the case. So, that brings me to our latest report, which was the April 7th report. Radically Practical Approach to Climate Policy. So why is this radically practical? Well, you'll see shortly. So the report is called The Way Forward, and this report is trying to find a practical way for Canadians and their governments to make progress on the issue of our generation and the issue for the next few generations. So this is where we start. We start by looking at, I should actually say, but even before we get to this point, in our report, we very quickly lay out that we are not climate scientists, we are economists, and we have no business, frankly, commenting on the climate science. But the overwhelming scientific consensus that exists that says climate change is real, and that climate change is driven by human action, and therefore there is a need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We take all of that as given. And then we say, all right, how are we doing so far? So take a look at this figure. This figure says, for every province has adopted an emissions reduction target for 2020. And if you add up the individual provincial targets, you get a number that's very close to, within a few percentage points of, the federal target for the country as a whole. So let's just look at the provincial targets, and what you see is pick your province, pick your favorite province, and what you'll see is in 8 out of 10 of those cases, the provinces will miss the targets. The projections are that they will miss those targets. So the black line in this figure is indexed to 1. That is the province's emissions in 2012. The red line is where those emissions are projected to be, given projections of economic growth and projections of the effectiveness of policies currently in place. That's the red line. And the blue line is the targets that have been officially adopted by those provinces. So what you'll see is in 8 of 10 of the cases, the provinces will miss their targets. And in most cases, they will miss them by a significant amount. So you look at this figure and you think, all right, I guess we need some more policy. I guess we need some more policy because we're not going to achieve the targets. Well, climate change is costly. Okay? Some people actually think there are no problems associated with climate change. We spend some time in the report talking about how Canadians are experiencing costs today. We wanted to make this point because for many people this issue is very intangible. We wanted to make it more tangible. And while we didn't add up all of the numbers because we don't claim to have an exhaustive list, exhausting possibly, but not an exhaustive list of all of the costs from climate change that are going on in Canada, there's a lot of them. Every sector, every region is impacted. So whether it is the decline in the economic value of the Western Canadian forests due to the infestation of the mountain pine beetle, or whether it is the declining economic value of the mollusk industry in Atlantic Canada, or whether it is the fact that it takes greater and more expensive air transport to get supplies up to the Diavik diamond mine in Northwest Territories because of climate change. The winters are shorter and the winter roads aren't in place for long enough. Or whether it's the rising costs in shipping because of lower water levels in the Great Lakes, St. Lawrence shipping area, or a whole bunch of other examples in between. Canadians are bearing costs today. And the longer we wait, the more those costs happen and the more those costs rise. And also the longer we wait, the more it will be necessary to introduce policy more aggressively later on. And one of the things you don't want to do is shock the system. You can introduce gentle policy and have it change gradually over time. But if you introduce shock therapy, there's a shock to the economic system. So if you are a government and you would like to achieve your 2020 targets, and we don't put any particular magic on the 2020 targets, there's going to be other targets and other emissions reductions beyond that, that frankly in the longer scheme of things will be more important. But what we try to do is we do a modeling exercise. We run a horse race between the two options that governments face. So we take the 2020 targets at face value, and we say, if you want to achieve your 2020 target, you have two broad options available to you. One is that you can use regulations, and the other is that you can use a market-based policy that has pricing at its core. So let me explain what these are. A regulation, often called command and control policy, is where the government says, okay, this firm, this sector, you must reduce by 10% in such and such a time frame, and if you don't, you pay a penalty. And very often, regulations of this kind would say, everybody reduce by 10%. So that actually can be quite effective. If the penalty is high enough to drive compliance, emitters will say, okay, I'm going to reduce my emissions, and they've been told to reduce by 10%, so they'll reduce by 10%, and it can be therefore effective at reducing emissions. What it generally can't be is cost effective. And the reason that it can't generally be cost effective is because the government generally doesn't know which sectors and which firms can reduce emissions cheaply and which firms and sectors can reduce emissions only expensively. That's information that sometimes the firms and sectors don't know themselves. So the government generally doesn't know that, yet it's telling everybody to reduce by 10%. So the result of this is that you have reductions in emissions, but you have high cost reduction in emissions. And this is and there's something about regulations that also makes it attractive to governments. If you are a finance minister, one of the things you don't like about a policy is that it shows up on your books. It either shows up on the revenue side or it shows up on the cost side, and either one kind of makes you feel queasy. Because if it shows up on your revenue side, then you get accused of increasing taxes. And if it shows up on your cost side, well, that's just showing up on your cost side. So when I can assure you, when I was at Department of Finance and as an advisor to Jim Flaherty, he didn't really like policies showing up on the books. The beauty of regulations is that they don't show up on the government's books, or they show up very, very little on the government's books, because they're not generating revenue, and they're not costing much except for administration. So basically, they don't show up on the books, but they are costly nonetheless. And the costs they impose are the costs they impose on the economy, on firms and households. So, why is pricing better? Pricing, first of all, can be achieved with a carbon tax, or it can be achieved with a cap-and-trade system. A cap-and-trade system is one where the government sets an aggregate, not by firm, not by sector, but an aggregate, economy-wide cap on the amount of emissions that are permitted, and then it prints up permits. So let's say in Ontario's case, where there's 160 megatons of emissions per year, the Ontario government would say, all right, let's suppose we want to reduce it in the first year from 160 to 150, so we'll print up 150 million coupons, and every coupon counts for 1 ton. And then we're going to either auction these off to the firms, or maybe we even give them away, or some combination. But then, and here is the magic part, not quite magic, but kind of cool, is that firms get to trade them in a marketplace. So that's the trade part of cap and trade. And as they trade these in the marketplace, a price is established. So whether you've got a carbon tax that directly sets the price, or you've got a cap and trade system that indirectly sets the price, both pricing mechanisms set a price on carbon emissions. So let's suppose that the price, tax or cap and trade, is $20 a ton. Firms and households, but most of this is going to be at firms, but I'll come back to that, say, ooh, if now every time I emit a ton of emissions, it's going to be 20 bucks to pay. So now I have an incentive to avoid that. Some firms can avoid it cheaply, some firms can avoid it at high cost. What's going to happen now through the process of the market is that you're going to seek out the lowest cost ways to reduce those emissions. Basically, the firms that can reduce their emissions cheaply are going to do it, and they're going to sell their permits for a profit. And the firms that can only reduce emissions very expensively are going to reduce less, and they're going to buy permits. So there's going to be an active trade in permits. So the result of this is that you end up with a market-determined allocation of who reduces emissions, who doesn't. It ends up being done in a cost-effective way. Everything is transparent. And the last thing I will say about a big advantage of a pricing mechanism over a regulatory approach is that a regulatory approach provides no incentives to do better than the regulation. The regulation says you reduce emissions by 10%. And when you reduce your emissions by 10%, you're done. And then you stop. Whereas if you put a $20 per ton, or whatever the number is, $20 per ton price on emissions, there is an ongoing incentive for firms or emitters to get better, get cleaner, because every time they reduce their emissions, they're adding directly to their bottom line. So over a period of a year or two, that difference may not matter much, but this is not a short-run policy exercise. We are not thinking about policy for the next 2 or 3 years. We're thinking about policy for the next 2 or 3 generations or more. So when you start talking about 10 years and 20 years and 40 years, that price on carbon is going to drive innovation. And that's a very important benefit of pricing rather than regulations. There is a growing movement globally for carbon pricing, reflecting exactly the advantages of pricing over regulations. So this is a map provided by the World Bank, and every year that gets more color on this map. So the color is countries that either have carbon pricing in place or are in the midst of doing it, and they're deliberating and they're close to pulling the trigger. And every year there's more color on that map. So you may have been wondering, where's the radically practical part? So let me tell you that there are 2 sets of people who were puzzled by our report. One set of people were people that didn't think that much about the operation of markets. And because they didn't think about how markets operate that much, they might have been surprised to learn that carbon pricing is so much better than a direct regulatory approach. So this is people basically that don't think about markets, so we'll call them non-economists, or ordinary human beings. How about that? Ordinary human beings. And then there's the non-ordinary human beings, otherwise known as economists. Economists think a lot about markets. Economists did not learn anything from this about why carbon pricing is better than regulations, because this is mother's milk to economists. But the economists' eyebrows were raised when they got to the next part of our paper. Because economists who, for the most part, accept carbon pricing as a good way to do things, they say, well, when they think about a carbon pricing system in their textbook world, and I don't denigrate textbooks, is that we'd want a common carbon price across the country. Because you get this efficient outcome. You seek out these low-cost emissions reductions, and you get the lowest cost when you have equated those carbon prices from Vancouver to Charlottetown and St. John's and other. So they were surprised to learn that we were suggesting provincial carbon pricing. And because our focus here is on two things. Number one, on carbon pricing rather than the alternative, but on doing it provincially. And this raised the eyebrow of many economists who said, no, this is crazy. This is crazy talk. This is going to be an inefficient hodgepodge of provincial systems. So the question then is, why would we recommend this provincially? And here's why. First and foremost, we are trying to think of what actually works on the ground, which means you've got to take principles from the textbook, but you've also got to apply it in the real world. This is a real world policy exercise. And the more and more we started thinking about how to design these policies and how they work and how they don't work and et cetera, we realized that the massive differences that exist across provinces would need to be built into the policies. So the more and more we looked at the provinces, the more and more we were reminded that provincial economies are very different. Their economic structures are very different. Their energy mixes are very different. Their emissions profiles are very different. And you'd want to build that into the policy. It is simply not true that a carbon price is a carbon price is a carbon price. Just like it's not true in terms of the government's design of a fiscal structure that it doesn't matter how you raise a dollar. A dollar is not a dollar, is not a dollar. A dollar raised through corporate tax is different and has different effects than a dollar raised through personal income tax, and that's different from a dollar raised through a value-added tax like the GST. It matters how you design it. And so the more and more we looked at provincial differences, we thought, well, you'd want to build these differences into the policy, but that's not something that automatically happens. It's not something that easily happens, that usually happens when you have the federal government design a policy. It tends to be a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. And the second thing is that carbon pricing is going to generate revenues. And if you're going to generate revenues that are going to flow from the provinces to the center, Ottawa, you're going to generate both economic and political challenges. And if you do this carbon pricing provincially, you sidestep those two complications instantly, simply, transparently. The province can design its own system, the province can keep the revenue, and the province can recycle the revenue in the way that most suits its economic needs and priorities. And you're going to design the system differently in different ways. You're going to recycle the revenues differently in different provinces. So it's interesting, you look at the three systems that exist already, and I'll come back to this, but the three systems that exist already in BC, carbon tax, Alberta, more complex regulation with elements of pricing, and Quebec, cap and trade system. Three completely differently designed systems, three completely different ways of recycling the revenue. Somewhere along the way you think maybe that's reflecting the differences in the provinces. And there are other reasons why we focus on the provinces. One is provinces are already acting. There's momentum. Those 3 provinces already have a policy in place. The discussion was live in Ontario. The discussion is live in Nova Scotia. Since Ontario has revealed its intention to create a cap-and-trade system, Manitoba is starting to make noises about this. There's provincial momentum. And if you're looking for a practical way to drive policy, you want to take advantage of momentum. Provincial policies, like in many domains in this country, provincial policies can act as laboratories where different provinces try different things. Some work, some don't work, and then you exchange information and best practices, and provinces can learn from each other. But I want to bring it back to those raised eyebrows of the economists who accuse us of advocating an inefficient hodgepodge. So we completely recognize that ultimately what you want is a common or a consistent carbon price across the country. But you don't have to start there. You can start with unilateral action, and you can work toward coordinating those policies and getting that consistent carbon price across time. So this is when we turn on the geeky coefficient and we do some modeling. So for those of you in the audience who think about modeling, so there's probably 3 of you, this is a great part, so sit up straight. For those people who don't like modeling, sit up straight, because it's going to be good, okay? So this is what we do. We say, all right, province by province, what we want to do is we want to do a modeling exercise that runs a horse race. We're going to take at face value each province's desire to achieve its 2020 emissions reductions targets. Take at face value. You got 2 options. You can use a regulatory approach where you say, in this model, that what we do is we say, all right, every sector, 17 sectors in each of 10 provinces, every sector reduces by the same percentage, and that percentage is enough to get our emissions to the 2020 target. Okay? That's the benchmark. That's the first row in the table. Okay? That's number 1 horse in the horse race. And number 2 horse in the horse race is, let's achieve exactly the same emissions reductions, but let's do it with a pricing policy. And we're going to put the price into the system that drives the emissions reductions that's exactly the same emissions reductions. But what we're going to do is we're going to do this in 3 steps. We're going to say, let's introduce pricing, and then let's recycle the revenues and get some more benefits, and then let's link up the systems. So here is a geeky chart that I won't spend very much time on. This is in the report, so for anybody who really wants to dig into this, you can dig into this. But every one of these bars, there's 1 bar for each province, and it shows you the 3 different types of benefits. I would draw your attention to the average, which is the Canada bar, which is just a weighted average of all of those provinces. You see 3 colors, 3 different stages to the bar. That's 3 different benefits. But let me give you a different slide that summarizes it. If horse number 1 is the regulatory approach and you achieve your 2020 target, and horse number 2 is the pricing approach that recycles the revenue, and then you connect up those provincial systems, the average benefit across all Canadian provinces is 3.7% of GDP in 2020. So let's just put that number in perspective. So let me just say it once more so you're sure what I mean. That if you use a pricing approach rather than a regulatory approach to achieve the same emissions reductions, it's better for GDP, national income, by 3.7%. Is this a big number? Or is this a small number? See, only economists think about percentage points of GDP, because that's our job. Normal human beings don't think about this. So I can give you this number in 2 different ways. 1 percentage point of GDP this year is $19 billion. 1 percentage point, $19 billion. So 3% is 57, 3.7% is blah, 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 something else, okay? But it's between 57 and 80, okay? That's a fair chunk of coin. But here's another way to think about it. In 2009, between November of 2008 and June of 2009, Canada went through a recession, and GDP fell, national income fell by 2.7%. 2.7%, it fell, it lasted that, for about 9 months, 12 months. That was a major recession. That was the global financial crisis. 2.7% lasted for, let's say, a year. This is 3.7% forever. This is a permanent difference to GDP of 3.7% by using one method rather than the other. So if you thought the global financial crisis in Canada was a serious event, and most people that I know thought it was a serious event, then this is a more serious event. And as I said, provinces are already acting. The 3 different provinces that have systems have 3 very different systems. BC introduced a carbon tax in 2008 that has been driving down per capita emissions, gently. Alberta actually was the first jurisdiction in North America to introduce any form of carbon pricing. It's got a more complex system. It's actually kind of a hard-to-understand system, but it's got elements of carbon pricing in it, but it's designed in a very different way. And Quebec has introduced a cap-and-trade system that really went live in terms of the auctioning off of those permits, and it's connected to California's system through the Western Climate Initiative in 2013. So Quebec's system, very well-designed cap-and-trade system, but it is young. And it is so young that we don't yet know how effective it will be, but it is designed very well. But there's lots of details. In our section 5 of the report, we talk about details. So let me just go quickly through the kinds of details that matter. It matters how high the price is. This is what we call stringency. It's not enough just to say, I've got a carbon pricing in place, but the price is low. What's going to drive behavior over time is ultimately a price that's high enough to drive behavior. Now, a low price is enough to drive behavior, but a low price is only enough to drive a little bit of behavioral change. A higher price drives a little bit more behavioral change. So what we recommend that provinces do is to introduce a carbon pricing system with a low price. $10 per ton is where BC started. It's now at $30. Alberta's price is $15. Quebec's is about $12. So somewhere in that ballpark. But then the important thing is gradually ramp it up over time. And as you gradually ramp up that price, you will drive the behavioral change with households and firms, and you will get emissions reductions. It matters how broadly you design the system. You don't want to design the system to only focus on one sector or a few sectors. All emissions within the province are equally damaging to the environment. What you want to do, not only for political acceptability reasons, but for cost effectiveness reasons, is you want to cast your net as widely as possible and design that system with as much breadth of coverage as is possible. And then it matters how you recycle the revenues. And different provinces are going to make different choices. BC has chosen by law, right, they designed their system by law that it would be revenue neutral. Every dollar raised by the carbon price would be returned through reductions in personal and corporate taxes and transfers to low-income families. Every dollar. Alberta generates much less carbon revenue, but it sends it all into a technology fund to drive innovation, mostly in the oil patch. Quebec generates about $500 million forecast value of revenues, and it uses kind of a balanced portfolio of ways to recycle revenues. But a lot of it is going into clean tech and to green infrastructure. So different provinces are going to make different choices. So this brings me to the recommendations, which kind of follow directly from what I've said. Recommendation 1 is introduce a carbon pricing system in your province. Number 2 is ramp it up in terms of the price, the stringency. Ramp it up gently over time. Number 3, design your system with as broad a coverage as is practically possible. You might not start at 100%, but BC was at 70-something and Quebec is at 80-something. So you can do that. And then you can work over time to get in the extra bits and pieces. And the last one is design the system to your provincial specifications. Take account of the differences in your economic structure to design a system that really works well for your province. But keep an eye open and a mind open for linking up those systems over time, the different provincial systems, so that you can get that consistent carbon price and you can get that last bit of benefits. So that is the end of the recommendations, but I still have a couple of slides. So what is the elephant in the room? Well, I put a question mark there. I'm not sure that Alberta is the elephant in the room, but some people think that Alberta is the elephant in the room, or that Saskatchewan is the elephant in the room, or that Newfoundland and Labrador is the elephant in the room. In discussions about climate policy, one of the comments is, one of the criticisms, frankly, that we're encountering is, this all sounds wonderful, but how are you going to deal with the elephant in the room? How are you going to make sure that Alberta puts this policy in place? How are you going to make sure that Saskatchewan puts this policy in place? And Newfoundland. But Saskatchewan and Newfoundland are small enough that most of the angst on this issue is directed toward Alberta. So the concern is, how are we going to get the largest growing, or so the fastest growing component of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, which is coming from Alberta and is coming from the oil sands, how are you going to get them into the game? And my answer is, what is going to lead Alberta to act is the recognition that it is in Alberta's interests to act. So this encounters a mental block right away, because there are a lot of people, either outside of Alberta or inside Alberta, who say, this is crazy talk. This can't possibly be in our interest. Our family business in Alberta is about oil. And carbon pricing is about anti-oil. Therefore, how can carbon pricing possibly be in the interests of a province that makes a big chunk of their income from producing oil? So what's the answer to that? Well, the answer is, so far, up until at least last night, so there have been some changes. There have been some modest changes on the Alberta political landscape, admittedly, modest changes. We've gone from a slightly kind of hazy blue to a bit of a hazy orange thing, you know, nothing serious. But but the previous premier, I mean Jim Prentice, I guess he's still the premier today, he actually expressed a commitment to 2020 targets. I don't actually know where Rachel Notley's position is on this, but I suspect that we will learn soon. And I suspect she will, well, I'm not going to predict. I don't know where she's going to be. But I do think that there are many people in Alberta who actually want to achieve their 2020 targets. Why? Well, because of two issues that I will call different types of market access. There's a lot of people in Alberta who, one of the fascinating things about this discussion across this country is that the discussion is going on in different parts of the country, and at a very high level, it's the same sort of conversation. It's what would carbon pricing look like, why should we do it, when should we do it, how should we do it? But the details of the conversation are completely different in different provinces. In Ontario, Ontario has a different economic structure, and Ontario has a different fiscal situation than other provinces. So they think about it as fitting into a broad policy package in a different way than Nova Scotia thinks about it. Nova Scotia thinks about population outflow and industrial decline and trying to rejig their entire tax structure in a way that will actually keep business here and keep people here. And the idea of taxing pollution rather than income resonates with some people in Nova Scotia. Alberta has a bit of a fiscal issue. Perhaps you've noticed that. They've got a missing $7 billion, and they've tried to fill that hole with a little bit of work, and they still got some work ahead of them. But they've also got the family business. The family business in Alberta is about oil and natural gas. And so some people think that their family business, some people recognize, I would say, that the family business is actually being threatened today. It's not being threatened by carbon pricing, it's being threatened by, if anything, the absence of carbon pricing. Is that there is a perception in the world that Alberta, and sometimes this perception is about Canada as a whole, but there's a perception that Alberta isn't doing what it could do, what it should do on the environmental front. And because of that, there is restricted market access. There's not the access for Alberta's oil to get to world markets that it would like. Why is it that we can name the 3 pipelines that currently aren't being built? We can all name the Northern Gateway and the Keystone XL and Energy East and maybe even the Trans Mountain. We can all name those pipelines. Yet there's 100 pipelines in this country that have been built over the last 40 years that none of us know the name of. Why? Because they got built and they were just not an issue. Pipelines have become a flashpoint, as have the oil sands, partly for a perception that that province is not making environmental headway. So you can argue, and this is a good debate, you can argue that if you actually had better environmental policies in place, which would include carbon pricing in my view, then you might actually get more of that market access. But the argument that really resonates with me is the next one, which is also about market access, but it's about a different kind of market access. If you look at the International Energy Agency's forecasts for energy use in the world, energy use, not surprisingly, matches more or less GDP growth. If global GDP is going to grow at 4.5% per year over the next 50 years, energy use will grow by about 4%, because we get energy more efficient by about 0.5 percentage point a year. And from that, you can come up with a forecast for oil use, because oil is a wickedly efficient energy source. And so those forecasts go from 93 million barrels a day today. I'll just repeat that number. 93 million barrels per day today of oil. Just take that number, multiply it by 365. Take off a couple of weekends if you like. Okay, multiply that by the world price of oil, and you know how big the oil industry is. It is just a big honking industry. But those forecasts show that oil use is going to go from 93 million barrels a day today up to 100, and then up to 110, before it then starts coming back down to 100 and 90 and 70 and 50. And it's going to take 50 years to make that transition toward low carbon, non-fossil fuel energy sources. It's just going to take a long time. So what happens in the intervening 50 years? Well, there's still a whole whack of oil that the world is going to be chugging down every day. And Alberta would like to sell its little sliver of that amount of the world demand. It would like to sell 3.5 million barrels a day or 4 million barrels a day. And how is it going to sell its 3.5 or 4 million barrels a day? Well, one of the problems is that Alberta oil, for the most part, is high up on the world cost curve. And as the world increasingly demands lower carbon products, lower carbon production methods, as they start to price carbon, because they are starting to price carbon, then if you're not pricing carbon, you're going to end up at the high end of the cost curve and you're going to get bumped out of that market. So the argument I would make, and I have made and I will continue to make in Alberta, is that it is absolutely in the interest of your family business, in the long run family business, to actually put carbon pricing in place. That carbon pricing will be a cost, but it's much more than a cost. It will be a cost that will drive the innovation that will be necessary over the long haul to make your product cleaner, more efficient, lower cost, so that in fact you can actually continue that family business for the next 10, 20, 30 years. Where you don't want is the world moving in this direction and Alberta producers remaining high up on the cost curve, and as the world then makes this transition, we just get bumped off. And I would make exactly the same argument in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland. It is my last, look at that, it's my last slide. So I'm done. Thank you very much, and I am more than happy to take whatever questions you may have. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for a great presentation. I'm really glad to see that you guys are doing this and see what effect it has on the conversation. I want to push you a little bit and find out what you have to say going beyond 2020. I guess it seems to me like the elephant in the room, in terms of Alberta, but more broadly, isn't just, okay, what's Alberta going to do with all that oil, and is that sustainable? Going from the climate science, I think there's been a shift from talking about just reducing emissions to, if we want to keep things at 2 degrees, or not even keep them, but take a coin flip at 2 degrees, beyond which the scientists say that's really not safe, we've got to keep a certain amount of carbon in the ground. And when you do the math on the carbon budget and you look at the reserves, there's a lot more carbon in the reserves across the oil sands and across the world than can be burnt to keep to that 2 degrees. And in business as usual, we're about 20 years away from going past 2 degrees. So it seems like for Alberta, they want to grow the oil sands and not just keep producing. And it doesn't seem like there's room to keep that pie going. Going beyond 2020, where the cuts go from these modest cuts, you have to get deeper and deeper cuts and really transition away from the oil industry, not in 50 years, and a lot of these projects are 50-year projects. Well, that seems like a lot harder challenge, and like there's going to be some reckoning for those who have made their bets with the oil business.
And the question is?
The question is, okay, going beyond 2020, are you guys in the Eco-Fiscal Commission, are you guys going to address the conversation around the 2 degree limit, the carbon budget, and how that's going to look in terms of increasingly strict, not just emissions reductions, but ultimate emissions control to, whether it's
Gotcha.
100 gigatons or whatever it is?
Gotcha. So I'll answer these as we go, and I'll try to be brief, okay? The short, honest answer is, I don't know whether we will address that. But let me tell you my prediction. My prediction is that we won't. And my prediction, and this is why I think we probably won't, is that we are not climate scientists. So we have a really hard time, well, like we just shouldn't, get into the discussion about the longer run climate science. And in our view, that is a long way away from where we are now, right? Even if it's 20 years or 25 years, it's a long way away from where we are now. So this is related to another question. So a lot of people ask, so what's the right price? What's the right price ultimately? And the answer is, I don't know. But it's just a lot higher than it is today. Because today the price is basically zero in most of Canada. And we need to get up to, and I don't know whether we need to get to 100 or 150, and this is related to another question, right? So we say our focus right now is to talk about ways that governments can actually break the impasse, get policies in place, and get on a sensible track. And then we can have those discussions. And it may not be us, right? It may be, because maybe we will have disappeared by that point. And somebody else will actually take up that conversation. Because it's a really important issue, right, is where you're going. Once you actually have these policies in place, where are you then going to go? How high are you going to go in terms of price? A related question is, what other measures are you going to put in place to drive the technological change that will also be a necessary part? Because pricing will drive technological change.
Do you mean carbon capture and storage?
Well, no, it could be carbon capture and storage, but it could be can you just generate renewables in the scale that you need, scale up enough, timely enough to generate the transition that you're talking about. Pricing will drive innovation and will drive change. The debate is, will pricing be sufficient to drive the innovation you need, scaled up enough, fast enough? And frankly, my answer is, I don't know. So, so that's my honest prediction that I think we probably won't get there. But it's a hugely important issue. But we're starting at the beginning. Okay? Sir.
And my name is Robert Milligan. And suppose in their discussions, the Prime Minister and new Premier of Alberta have one which leads to her convincing him that he has to abandon his Koch brothers economic ideology and move to something closer to what you believe in, which is more practical and more necessary if we're going to deal with climate change. Then what would you suggest the federal government with this reborn Stephen Harper might do to play an effective role in collaborating with the provinces to better realize what you're advocating?
Okay, so I just want to make sure I understand the question. The question, I think, is what is the role, what would I recommend the role for the federal government to be as complementary to what I'm suggesting?
Yeah.
Is that the question?
Yes, assuming that the Prime Minister was open to this.
Well, but I would make the same recommendation actually to any Prime Minister.
Okay.
I mean,
well, it's got to be something he'll listen to. You know.
Okay,
Yeah.
So it's a great question. So I think, so great question that gets kind of generated from this report is, if we're talking about carbon pricing being done practically and sensibly at the provincial level, what are we talking about for the feds? Well, we don't focus on the federal role, but let me tell you things that aren't emphasized in the report. The federal government is doing things and can continue to do things that are very important that aren't carbon pricing. So the federal government currently has regulations on vehicles, very sensible. They have public support for technological development in Sustainable Development Technology Canada, SDTC, perfectly sensible. They represent us in international forums, perfectly sensible. We could debate, I suspect, about whether you think they're representing us well or poorly, but they can represent us. In the provincial carbon pricing world, the issue will come up at some point about how do we deal with border issues? Do we deal with issues between provincial borders, across provincial borders, and across the national border? And that gets the federal government into the game. So there is a role for the federal government to be very engaged, very constructive, supporting technology, using some smart regulations. But all of that can be quite independent of the carbon pricing. A government can be very supportive of provincial carbon pricing without actually being in that game. Because, for the reasons that I've talked about, I think that to have the federal government in that exercise is pretty complicated. And I've said exactly that to the federal parties.
Thank you.
Sir.
Hi there. My name is Martin Collier. I'm with Transport Futures, and actually welcome to the game of congestion pricing, because we've been at it for about 7 years now. We've had about 115 international people.
We'll be stealing your best ideas.
Okay. Well, and I have I have one idea that I hope you'll steal, especially because we've had about 120 international speakers now over the last 6 years coming from London, from Stockholm, from Singapore, from Germany, from many different countries and here at home to talk about how road pricing would work to decrease emissions, but obviously, first of all, decrease congestion, because our trajectory for transportation emissions, as you know, is the fastest growing of all the climate change emissions. So I think what I've learned anyway in the last 7 years is don't write another report. What we need to do is actually demonstrate how these things can work through pilot projects, designing pilot projects that people can actually experience how these things can work, probably at first on a volunteer basis, but over time we could actually maybe have one of the provinces like Ontario with Metrolinx actually try a pilot themselves, that kind of thing. And also that obviously means leadership. So I think those are the two missing things. We have to design pilot projects to demonstrate how these things could work, plus have leadership. And unfortunately, You have a great Canadians on your board and advisors, but unfortunately they didn't do anything when they're actually in power. So I think it's time that we have to talk to the people who are in power to take those decisions. And at the same time, there's infrastructure being built right now in the short term, right between Kitchener and Guelph. There's a new highway that they're going to spend probably, they say $300 million, but it's going to be up to $600 million. But for sure, by the time it's built in 5 years, and we have to stop that kind of infrastructure from being built in the first place, and instead do pilot projects. So please don't write another report. Please help us design pilot projects. We need some of that $4 million you have to actually run these programs, because it's not cheap to do, and right now governments aren't ready to do it.
Okay, thank you. I cannot promise that we won't write a report, okay? But I do promise that we will write a good report, not suggesting that other reports were not good. But our reports are a little different, because we really are focusing on what can practically work in terms of road congestion pricing, what can work, and so we've got an interesting paper in the works. But I really like the idea. We can't do a pilot project, at least with our current budget, but talking to some of the larger cities about doing pilot projects, I completely agree with you. What you're saying, we don't need yet another report to sit on a shelf.
Reports have all been written. They've all been written. They're all out there.
And we've read most of them.
I can give you the people who've done it, so why waste time doing another one? We got to get done. We've been talking about it for 7 years, and it just means more talk, more talk, more talk. We got to do action, and that's the best way to demonstrate to people who are, a lot of people, actually I ran for election in Guelph just to see what would happen if I went to the doors of people and actually talked about road pricing and parking pricing.
And what happened?
And 90%, when you explained it to them, were very interested and actually supportive. So I didn't win. I got 1,300 votes in 6 weeks, which wasn't bad for that short time.
You need to get that 90%
I need to get out there
92.
earlier. So I was too busy talking about road pricing.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll continue the conversation.
Good, thank you. Sir.
My name's Donald Fraser. I'm a retired lecturer, and my question is about carbon cap and trade. How is it possible to actually police, with all the companies there are and all the carbon use, how is it possible to police if, the amount that they really use, or to really check to see if they use what they stay within their permits that are sold to them?
Good question. And this is a question that applies not just to cap and trade systems, it applies to a carbon tax as well. Because in both cases, what you need to do is to be able to monitor emissions from the emitter. So let's suppose you've got a coal-burning electricity generating plant, right? So you've got emissions that are going up the smokestack. You need, whether it's a carbon tax or a cap and trade or a more complex hybrid system, whatever the system is, if you're going to charge people for a ton of emissions, you have to be able to measure the emissions. So in both cases, this is a problem to be solved. But this is not a big problem, okay? For large emitters in particular, measuring emissions is not a big deal. But you've got to not just measure, you've got to monitor. You've got to be able to say, oh, hold on, you've only got 10 permits, but you've emitted 12, therefore you've got to pay for 2, or something like that. So this is an issue. This is, by the way, also an issue for income tax, right? We have to measure your income tax. We have to monitor to make sure that you're declaring all of your income. So anytime you have a tax system or a revenue collection system, you have the measurement and monitoring and enforcement problems. So while there are challenges to these systems, I would not say that those are at the top of the list. Thank you. Sir.
Hi, I'm Jesse Wilson. You talked a lot about incentives. Could you talk a little bit about the negative incentives, about things like, we're going to build our factory. Are we going to build it in southwestern Ontario where we have to pay for carbon? Or are we going to build it in Pollutopia where we're carbon emissions free?
In where?
Pollutopia. It's the place where you could pollute for free.
I was thinking, Ohio? Ohio? Well, where is that? Pollutopia. I like that. I like that. Okay. So just on incentives, if you want to read a good book about how incentives are cool and how incentives matter, I recommend that you read Freakonomics. Okay, Freakonomics, and there's, Freakonomics 2 and, super Freakonomics and Freakonomics all over again. I mean, it's now an industry. But it is a very readable book about incentives in bizarre places and understanding why they matter. So that's that. Great question. So this is a really important, this is the issue of competitiveness for firms and leakage. So let's suppose you're in Ontario. Ontario introduces a cap and trade system, and the cap and trade system generates a $20 per ton carbon fee, carbon price, for every ton of emissions. And New York and Ohio and Pennsylvania don't. Now, all of a sudden, you have a plant that's maybe a car plant, or maybe it's a solar panel production facility, whatever it is, that says, oh, well, now I actually have to pay the carbon price in Ontario, but I don't have to pay the carbon price in Ohio or New York or Pennsylvania, so I'm just going to zip across the border, okay? And when they zip across the border and they pick up shop in Ontario and they plant themselves in Plutopia, it's just not rolling off my Plutopia. We'll just miss the first O. When they plant themselves in Plutopia, you will have borne the economic cost of their departure. Their emissions will have fallen in Ontario, but the emissions will rise again in Plutopia, and global emissions will be unchanged. So this is bad. We want to make sure this doesn't happen. This is a really important issue.
And jobs don't get created in Ontario.
No, that's right. So I said the economic costs, right? Because you lose the production. So you want to pay attention to this. So a number of comments here, and they'll come gushing out in no particular order. But one of them is that this is not an issue for all firms in all sectors. There are some firms and some sectors that are particularly emissions intensive and that can easily move. And those are the ones where they're more likely to move than the others. Some sectors aren't emissions intensive. And so when they face the carbon fee or carbon tax or carbon price, it's just no big deal, okay? So, but you gotta think about which ones are emissions intensive and which ones are trade exposed, because those are the ones that are potentially the problem. And when you do that, and I promise you there will be a report in our near future that looks at this detail, the number of firms and sectors for which this is a problem is small. It is a small subset of the total universe of firms and sectors. So that's the first point. The second point is this problem gets often exaggerated. Number one, because the people that are worried about this don't think about how it's a problem for only some firms and only some sectors. They just think this is a problem for everybody, and it's not. But it also gets exaggerated in another way, which is that, so right now, there is a $12 per ton carbon price in Quebec. There is a $0 carbon price in Ontario. When was the last time you saw economic activity flowing out of Quebec into Ontario, wait for it, because of the carbon price? I mean, you see economic activity flow out of Quebec into Ontario for all kinds of reasons, but is it because of the carbon price? And firms make their locational choices as a function of a whole bunch of things. Corporate tax rates, pension regulations, minimum wages, labor laws, price of real estate that matters for their ability to recruit workers, health plans. I mean, all kinds of stuff. And this is one more thing. So I would say in the long run, this is a really important issue. You want to get the prices the same on jurisdictions. And if the US isn't acting, then we don't want to get too far away from them. Okay? But that's not a problem now. See, we're kind of taking this practical short-run view. That might be a problem later, but we can deal with it through revenue recycling. So I can come back to that. But don't overestimate how important this problem is. BC has a $30 carbon tax right now. Alberta has at most 15. How many people are seeing firms flooding over the Rogers Pass into Alberta? Not very many. So this is an issue for some firms at some times, and you've got to pay attention to it, but it is not an issue for all firms at all times. But look for that upcoming report.
Thank you.
Because we will talk about this issue. We might even use Plutopia. I like it. Plutopia, sir.
Hi there, my name's Tony Stortz, and you mentioned earlier that not putting a price on carbon would push Alberta up the curve and out of the market for being too high of a price. As someone without an economics background, could you clarify how not pricing carbon handicaps their oil economy in the long run?
Sorry, could I clarify how pricing carbon will?
How not pricing carbon would handicap Alberta's oil economy in the long run.
Good, good. Okay, so this is kind of a counterintuitive point. Because a carbon price will increase the cost to intensive industries. Andrew Leach, Professor of Andrew Leach in the Business School at University of Alberta, has estimated that in the oil sands today, if you put a $30 per ton carbon price in place, it would reduce after-tax cash flow for your typical oil sands operator by X dollars. You want to take a vote on how big X is? How many people think, everybody has to vote, okay, go with me here. How many people think that a $30 per ton carbon price would increase after-tax costs by $10 per barrel? $5 per barrel, $20 per barrel. $20 per barrel? Some hands. His number is $1.50. Okay, it would reduce after-tax cash flow by $1.50. So this is an increasing cost. So some people say, well, how could you impose a cost on an oil sands firm and have this do anything other than increase their cost? And the answer is, in the very short run, it would increase your cost, right? But it's not just, this is the beauty of incentives. It's not just increasing your cost by $1.50. It's increasing your cost when you emit greenhouse gases. And there's a clear financial incentive to not emit greenhouse gases. So the oil sands is very innovative. Very, very innovative. Don't believe the people that tell you that the oil sands is just, Canada being hewers of wood and drawers of water. It's extremely innovative. But it can be more innovative. And what would drive it to be more innovative is two things. Number one, a carbon price that says, man, I got to come up with some innovative way to reduce these emissions. So I'm going to invent some better way to produce this because I want to avoid the cost. That's the key point. But the second thing is, when the government raises the revenue from the carbon price, what does it do? And currently in Alberta, they're using the revenues to go into a tech fund to then invest in lower carbon technologies, largely in the oil patch. So by pricing, you can drive the innovation, which drives down costs. And by technological development, you can drive down costs. So this is a long-run argument. And so this is not something that's going to happen with a $30 carbon price that's going to lower costs in 2 years. It won't. But it'll do it over time. And as it does it over time, those firms are going to be better positioned. This is not a guarantee. But the worst thing that they're going to face is not being as innovative as the world demands lower carbon, and then they're stuck high up on the cost curve, and they end up getting punted out of the market, because that's how that market will work. How's that?
That's good. I have one follow-up question then. Do you think the world will demand lower carbon overall?
I think the world is demanding lower carbon, and I think that will continue.
Okay.
So, I mean, why do I think that? I'm an optimist. I think that because I think it's happening. Like there's a lot of momentum in this issue, right? The IMF, the managing director of the IMF, this is not a radical left-wing organization. This is the IMF. And they stand up and they say, hey, this is a problem, and carbon pricing is a really good way to think about this. The World Bank says it. Hank Paulson, former Republican Secretary of the Treasurer, right, has come up now with a band of merry men talking about the Risky Business Project, talking about the need to price carbon as a way to deal with climate change. Preston Manning, our advisor. Preston Manning. The press, when we launched on November 4th, the press picked up on Preston Manning. They didn't really care about anything else. They cared about Preston Manning because, holy smokes, Preston Manning is the godfather of the small c conservative movement in Canada, and he believes in pollution pricing and carbon pricing, and for 2 weeks he was gold talking to whoever would listen about carbon pricing. So there's unusual voices coming forward, and this is happening in the world. You look at that world, just keep an eye on that World Bank map every year for the next 10. And my prediction is it'll get more and more red and blue and yellow or whatever colors are on there. It'll get painted colors. So yes, I think the world is moving in this direction. Do I do this question here? This question, can anybody see this question? No, only me. Then I can just make it up. Okay, I can't make it up. Regulations and pricing don't seem mutually exclusive. I agree. Is it not likely, even ideal, that the two operate together? Catherine A., great question. Absolutely right. So here's one of the dangers that we have encountered already. We are taking this very narrow lens. You know, the eco-fiscal lens. We're saying we are looking for opportunities to price pollution, recycle the revenues. This two-part policy, this is what we're going to think about. We're not going to think about a whole bunch of other types of environmental or economic policies. There's all kinds of good and bad environmental and economic policies, but we're going to focus on the eco-fiscal ones. That's not because we think that pricing pollution is the only way to deal with it. It's a really good way, it's a really important part of an overall policy package, and currently it's a massively underused part in Canada and frankly in most countries. So our focus is on looking for opportunities to talk about eco-fiscal policies, but absolutely there is a role for regulations. Some things are best done with regulations. If you've got situations where you've got a small number of emitters, pick your pollutant. Okay? Small number of emitters, and their technology is all roughly the same. Using regulations is actually pretty good. But for carbon emissions, you've got a very large number of emitters all over the place. Small, medium, large numbers, and their technologies are all completely different. This is just textbook land, perfect situation to use carbon pricing, where the benefits of carbon pricing or pollution pricing, will shine through. So yes, there is a role for regulations. I think you got to be careful about how you design those regulations, but you got to be careful about how you design any policy. So absolutely there's a role for both regulations and pricing. We're just going to focus on pricing. I think I'm done.
A few quick comments before we adjourn. First of all, thank you, Chris, for your lecture this evening. I'm not sure whether we've all been radicalized or made more practical or both, but I'm sure that we understand the difference between regulatory and pricing approaches to climate change more clearly than we did, and we probably can see more clearly how economic and environmental interests can go hand in hand. These are early days for your Eco-Fiscal Commission, but if its goal is to inform and stimulate the policy discussion, then you're clearly already making good headway in these early days. And for bringing your show to Waterloo tonight, we thank you once again. Appreciate it. We're going to post the edited video of this evening's live webcast to the CG website, where you can see it without the glitches that occurred. Apparently our system didn't speak well with the PowerPoint, but it didn't show up that way on the webcast. So we'll also post a blog where you can add your comments if you wish. And then in the coming weeks, we invite you to join us for these events at the CG Auditorium. On Thursday, May 21st, we welcome Professor Michael Bell of Carleton University to discuss liberal attitudes and Middle East realities. On Wednesday, May 27, John Fullerton, the founder and president of Capital Institute, will speak to the CG audience on reimagining capitalism. On June 8th, we'll be screening the documentary film Red Lines. You saw the trailer just before this lecture about two young Syrian activists who launch a plan for bringing democracy to Syria. And then our season ender is on June 17th. It's our annual media panel, and it's co-sponsored by the Waterloo branch of the Canadian International Council. And this year, you'll hear about the need for Canadian reporters' eyes on foreign news, and our speakers include the top news executives of some of Canada's most influential media, the Globe, CTV, CBC, and the Toronto Star. So register for all of these events online and for our events newsletter, and thank you for joining this evening. Have a safe journey home.
So, and I hope you'll excuse me if I wander a little bit away from the podium, because I have a Madonna-style microphone, so I'm allowed to do that. So what brings the Commission together, so these 12 economists backed up by this advisory board of really exceptional Canadians, and I'll get to them later, but what brings us together is the shared conviction that we can do better as an economy and as a country in terms of economic performance and in terms of environmental performance, and that those two things really go together. There's an obstacle in this. The obstacle is the belief that those things don't go together. The obstacle is the belief that you can't have more of one without less of the other. But we actually think that if you look at some of our policies in place today, and I'll get in more detail, that we can actually have our cake and eat it too. That we can actually rejig some of our policies in ways that will improve the environment and improve the economy at the same time. So here is just a little bit of data to suggest that we can do better in terms of environmental performance. So here's what is going to be on the right-hand side of that diagram when it comes up. There's going to be 3 different measures of our nation's output per unit of some sort of resource used, okay? The amount of output or income we generate relative to the amount of resources that we use to generate that income, or water we use to generate that income, or greenhouse gas emissions that we emit in the process of generating that income. So a low per capita, that's a measure, that's the broadest measure of average per person income, GDP being gross domestic product. And Canada does very well. Canada's not the highest in this group of countries, but we're pretty high. But you all know that. You know that we are a rich country, and we are lucky to be in a rich country. But the problem, when you see this graph, is going to be in the middle set of figures, because the middle set of figures is going to show how Canada performs in terms of innovation relative to the other countries. That middle set shows that Canada doesn't do too well in terms of our innovation performance relative to these other countries. So here's the connection between the second set of figures and the third, the ones on the right, is that what drives GDP per capita over the long haul, and I don't mean over 1 year to the next, but over 5 years and 10 years and 30 years, what drives per capita income is productivity growth. And what drives productivity growth is innovation. So even though we're doing quite well on the right-hand side of this figure, if we don't pick up our game in the middle part of this figure, we're not going to be able to continue doing well on the right-hand side. Poor performance in innovation will threaten our current high living standards. So we've got to get more innovative if we want to sustain our richness. So we can do better in terms of the environment, and we can do better in terms of the economy. So what's our solution? Just take a moment to read this cartoon. If some of you have bad eyes,
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Centre for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI, as we say. My name's Fred Kuntz. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CIGI. I'd like to thank our public event sponsor, Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support of the CIGI Signature Lecture Series. Thanks also to you for joining us at this event, whether you're here as part of the live audience or joining us through our webcast. Following this evening's address, we welcome questions from both audiences here at the CIGI Auditorium at the microphones at the bottom of the stairs, or through the live chat function on your screen if you're watching from home. Please remember to state your name and to keep the questions brief. Many Canadians agree we need to take action on climate change, but some also worry about the effect on the economy. This false dichotomy, which pits environmental headway against economic well-being, has unfortunately polarized the climate discussion in Canada and made progress difficult. So instead, Here to propose what he calls a radically practical approach to advancing the climate policy debate is Christopher Ragan. Chris has been a professor of economics at McGill University since 1989. He's a research fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute, where from 2010 through 2013, he held the Institute's David Dodge Chair in Monetary Policy, and for many years was a member of the Institute's Monetary Policy Council. He's also the author of Economics, the most widely used introductory economics textbook in Canada, and he has a regular column in the Globe and Mail. He's been a special advisor in the Federal Department of Finance and the Bank of Canada. And since November 2014, Chris has also been chair of Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission. The commission was formed by a group of experienced policy-minded economists from across the country, as you saw in the video, seeking to broaden the discussion of eco-fiscal policy reform beyond the academic sphere and into the realm of practical policy application. The Eco-Fiscal Commission and its commissioners are fully independent, and they aim to serve policymakers across the political spectrum at all levels of government, issuing publications and research over the next few years to promote a more informed discussion of one of the most serious and urgent challenges facing humanity today. So please join me in welcoming tonight's special guest, Professor Chris Ragan.
Thank you very much, Fred. Thank you all, and thank you to CG for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here. I've been in this room speaking once before, and every time I come into this room, or at least both times so far, I just think that McGill desperately needs a room like this. I like giving lectures or talks, but I really like giving them in nice spaces. So Fred and I were just talking on the way over from the restaurant how nice it would be to give a talk like this in a Roman Colosseum kind of thing. So if you ever build one of those, please let me know. So what I would like to talk about is a little bit about the commission itself, and mostly about the report that we released a few weeks ago. And if the radically practical approach to climate policy piques your interest, that's a good thing. I won't tell you yet why it is radically practical, but I'll get there. Measure is a bad thing. A low measure says we don't get much output out of a lot of resource input or a lot of water input or a lot of CO2 emissions. A high measure would be a good thing. And what you'll see eventually will be, you'll see three sets of bar charts. And the red one is Canada, of course. And there's 6 other countries, and they are different colors. And the other countries are chosen to be in 2 groups. The other countries are some of the kind of usual comparator countries, rich G7 type countries, the UK, United States, Germany, etc. But there's also a couple of countries that are chosen because they're small and they're resource intensive, Norway and Australia. And when that chart goes up, what you'll see, interesting, I mean, I think this is a test. I think this is a test. What you'll see is that Canada actually is lower than the other 3. Look at that. 3 right-hand side sets of bar charts. You'll see that Canada is lower than most of the other countries, which means we are inefficient in terms of our use of resources, not our production of resources, our use of resources when we produce output, and our use of water when we produce output, and our emission of CO2. We just do a lot of that resource use in terms of our producing. So we could be better in terms of our environmental and our resource performance. And so the screen you see here is 3 sets of bar charts. This is about our performance in economic terms. So what you'll see is 2 things that I'm going to draw your attention to. One is our GDP